Hello, Irish fans, and welcome back to another edition of the Irish Breakdown podcast. I am Vince DeDario. I'm the football analyst here at irishbreakdown.com, and with me, as always, is Bryan Driskell. He is the man, the myth, the legend, and the publisher of irishbreakdown.com, and we had an interesting debate or chat the other day, and we're like, you know what? This would make a great podcast.
It was something we actually disagreed on, which I know some people, are like, you guys agree on everything. Well, it's because Vince is really smart. So, but in this instance, we're not totally on the same page. So we thought it'd be a fun podcast to do.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So ACC title game. I mean, this is a big deal for Notre Dame and for Clemson, believe it or not. This is the first title game in a while where they actually have something to prove. And it's not just another game to get to the college football playoff for Clemson.
Against some mediocre Virginia, Pitt,
right.
Something like that.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's kind of been an afterthought the last few years with Clemson. And it is no longer an afterthought. I think we can safely say that Notre Dame is going to be the stiffest competition that they've had in quite some time in this game. So it's a big deal. But what does it mean big picture? So that's what we're going to get into today. But before we do, we want one of our advertisers, one of our sponsors, to get a word in here. So here is our first sponsor.
Pele leaned in and said something to Freddie.
Don't let them change you. Keep working on what makes you different and what makes you special. It was great advice, but it caused me some problems.
But what could change Freddie Adu?
Soccer is going to explode, and it's going to be around this kid.
We were the Beatles. Everywhere we went, it was the Freddie Show.
And with that came the expectation, and with that came the pressure.
New episodes of American Prodigy drop Tuesdays from Blue Wire Podcasts.
Okay, welcome back. Let's just jump right in, Bryan. Again, this is a big game, but what does it mean? What does it mean small picture? What does it mean big picture? These are all things that we're going to dive into today. So let's start off with what's at stake in 2020 for Notre Dame right now. What's at stake for this team?
Well, I think the biggest thing, obviously, is the college football playoff berth, and then also the seeding in the college football playoff,
right.
which matters. A win means you either get a rematch against Clemson or you get a matchup against Ohio State, neither of which are going to be easy. But in a very strange scenario, which I don't necessarily see happening, potentially a matchup against the Texas A&M, which I think a lot of wild stuff would have to happen. It'd have to be Ohio State loses, Notre Dame beats Clemson in a close game, and the committee decides Clemson stays in and they're 4, and then that would be a weird scenario that I don't see happening. But it's about seeding. And do you want to play Ohio State in round 1, or do you want to play Alabama in round 1?
Right.
And then also there's the outside chance that I have a hard time with Florida losing. I have a hard time seeing a scenario in which Notre Dame doesn't get in. There's no way that USC is getting in. No way.
They're too far behind.
They have the same record as Ohio State. Yeah, they've beaten no one. I think It wasn't until the 4th game of the year that they beat a team that had a win, and they haven't exactly looked really impressive doing it. Where with Ohio State, you can say, yeah, they played a bunch of bad teams outside of Indiana, but they destroyed those teams.
Sure.
Whereas USC's like coming from behind to beat Arizona State, who just got their first win recently. Now, it was an impressive first win, and it got a coach fired, but it was still their first win of the season. Utah didn't get their first win until, I think, last weekend, so it's different. Not all 6-0s are built the same. Not all 9-0s are built the same, which is why Coastal Carolina is not in the playoff conversation.
Sure.
So, I think it's small picture, on the micro level, it's a college football playoff berth is at stake, and seeding is at stake, and seeding matters because seeding could help determine whether or not you're playing one college football playoff game or if you're going to get a chance to play 2.
Yeah,
so I think that to me is the first thing, Vince, that's at stake in this matchup.
Well, and I think more so for Notre Dame, if we're talking the Notre Dame side of things, I think a playoff berth is a lock. And
I do too.
And we've talked about that in the past, and there's an article on irishbreakdown.com about that after Florida lost. Notre Dame's a lock for the playoff. I think it's more important seeding. And I think you bring up a good point. If they win, they're the number 2 seed, barring some ridiculous outcome for the Alabama-Florida game, right? I mean, so if Notre –
Well, but if LSU can beat Florida, then Florida can beat Alabama. I mean, that's that's the thing I learned. But, yeah, barring Florida – and if you're a Notre Dame fan and you care about the number 1 seed, then you're a big Florida Gator fan this weekend.
Sure.
But, yes, I believe that a win locks them into the number 2 seed.
Yeah, and so they stay right where they're at. They're number 2, and they'll face off against whoever number 3 is, which would be presumably Ohio State.
I just don't see Northwestern. I think LSU beating Florida was less of a shock than Northwestern beating Alabama. No, Ohio State would be.
No love for Northwestern.
No.
I see.
Well, I mean, they're having a nice year and they've got a couple good wins, but Florida's not Ohio State. I mean,
no.
That's the first thing. And number 2, Northwestern just doesn't have it's the team that lost to Michigan State.
Sure.
Right. Ohio State didn't play well against Michigan State, in my opinion, and won 52-12.
Right.
Michigan State stinks,
Yes,
so and the problem is Northwestern just doesn't have a lot of athletes. They got a couple on defense, but overall just don't have athletes. And if you don't have athletes, you're going to have a hard time beating Ohio State. And if you think about the teams that have beat Ohio State lately, it's teams that had good athletes. It was Purdue in 2018. Rondell Moore went off in that game. Iowa had some really good athletes in the secondary that year that they beat Ohio State. Had some guys on offense that were good football players. Northwestern doesn't really have that. And that's why I just don't think they're a really well-coached, tough team, but they don't have the athletes to hang with Ohio State. So, yeah, that would be a big shocker. Where LSU, it's always – you knew LSU had great talent. It just was really young talent. And, it's always that when you have a team like that, Vince, you know this, there's always that one game where that team can put it all together. I mean, it's like in 2016, as bad as Notre Dame was, they beat a 9-win Miami team that year.
Yeah, that's true.
You know what I mean? So – when a team has talent, you just don't want it to be that game where they put it all together for that game. That's what it was for Florida against LSU. Northwestern can't do that. So a little tangent. I mean, I think Ohio State is who I would expect to be Notre Dame's first round opponent if they beat Clemson.
Right. Do you see a scenario if Notre Dame loses to Clemson that they're not the 4 seed?
Meaning they stay the 3 seed?
Or 2 or whatever. Anything that's not 4.
Yeah, I think if Ohio, I could see a scenario in which, if Ohio State loses or wins in an ugly fashion and finish 6-0, and Notre Dame loses in a really close game against Clemson, the committee has a choice to make. Do you want to have a Notre Dame Clemson rematch in the first round, or do you want it to be in the title game? Personally, I think they would probably go for the title game because
I agree.
Maybe part of it might depend on, let me see what the ratings are for this game first. But the ratings for the first game were phenomenal.
Yes, they were.
People may not want to see a third matchup, but I mean, personally, I would not want to see a rematch in the title game. I'm just not a big fan of that. So I could see a scenario in which they say, hey, we're gonna keep Clemson, Notre Dame 2 and 3. Give us some sign about, and it would be an accurate thing. Well, look, Notre Dame didn't lose to their 11th game. Right. Ohio State could win the Big Ten title, play two playoff games, and still be 3 games away from the point where Notre Dame finally lost the game.
I think that's honestly the scenario that you just laid out to me feels, and the word fair doesn't really work here, but it feels more legitimate. I think that Notre Dame and Clemson, if Notre Dame loses this game and it's a competitive game, I think Clemson 2, Notre Dame 3 is where you should rank them. Now, will they do the whole avoid the first round and all that? I didn't think of it before, but now that you mention it, having 2 different conferences playing for the title, I think is better than 2 ACC teams playing for the title.
Because I didn't have any interest in the Georgia Alabama game in 2017.
Right,
I watched maybe half of it, and I really didn't have a lot of interest in that game for the exact reason that you just mentioned. You want to see a matchup. We don't see a whole lot, which is again why I don't think they're going to be in love with the possibility. Now they could say, "Hey, look, we're going to put Clemson against Alabama," or drop Notre Dame to 4, put them against Alabama, and then Ohio State 3 against Clemson, and you think that would decrease the odds that both of them win and you play in a title game. So there could be that too. But
it's interesting.
My guess would be they drop to 4.
I agree. I agree.
Even in a scenario where the game plays out a lot like it did last time, but Notre Dame loses this one, I still think they would drop to 4. I don't think Ohio State should be ranked ahead of Notre Dame right now, but I think that's what. I also don't think Ohio State should be ranked 4th in the playoff poll.
That's another podcast, buddy.
Yeah, that's where they are. That's where they are.
Okay, I got a question for you. And this came up the other day as well. Is this a bigger game for Notre Dame football or for Notre Dame fans, in your opinion?
In what regards?
In regards to, I don't know. There's a stigma with Notre Dame fans about winning a big game, and I think people are dismissing the Clemson game. It's not a big game, and
outsiders are doing people outside that. Okay,
yes, absolutely.
I think it's a bigger game for Notre Dame fans because Notre Dame football. It's like, look, if Notre Dame loses this game, I think it's gonna impact both, right? And we'll kind of talk about that at the end of the show. But I think for Notre Dame fans, I think the Clemson win kind of finally gave them some real, bragging rights for the first time in a long time. Like not just, hey, we beat Michigan, bragging rights, but bragging rights over a big time program. And I think a lot of that was kind of sucked away because Clemson fans are like, forget it. Trevor didn't play and Tyler Davis didn't play. So, you can't really trash talk them because they just dismiss it. Like, whatever. It doesn't matter.
Right,
we'll wait till we play you again. Well, if Clemson goes out there and smacks Notre Dame in the mouth, and Notre Dame fans are, get a lot of humble pie is going to be dished upon Notre Dame fans for the excitement that they genuinely felt and should have felt after that win. So, I think there's a lot at stake for both, but I think the immediate impact is that I think there's going to be some sting for Notre Dame fans. But again, it part of it depends on who is that. That sting could last weeks, or that sting could last less than 24 hours, because if the next day the matchups come out and what you just mentioned, and it's Notre Dame versus Clemson in the first round of the playoff, then it's like, oh, okay, wait till round 3. We're going to have round 3, and it gives them a little something to be excited about. But small picture, I think it's immediate impact is, I think it's bigger for it's more impactful for Notre Dame fans. Big picture down the road, once the season's over with, I think there's obviously a lot more at stake for the Notre Dame football program, which we'll get into here in a little bit.
Yeah, I think I agree with that. I think in the micro, as you put it earlier, I think that Notre Dame's going to the playoff, and whether they win or lose this game, it's going to be competitive. I don't agree with the 10.5 points that Vegas has put on this game. That's crazy to me. But I think it's going to be competitive, and I think you can pull a lot of positives out of a game like that if you're Notre Dame, if you happen to lose. So you still have all of your goals in front of you. The only thing you miss out on if you lose this game is the ACC championship.
Right.
And that is a legitimate goal for this team. There's no question. It is. But at the same time, if they don't win it, then, hey, they haven't won a conference title ever. So, I mean, whatever.
But, there's so many non-Notre Dame fans waiting to just say, to pounce on that.
When Notre Dame joined the ACC this year, I immediately just had this vision of Brian Kelly just grabbing that ACC championship trophy and just flipping off the crowd and walking back in the tunnel. We're here. Let's go. We got this.
Yeah, maybe now you guys can shut up about how we need to join a conference.
So I think it's more important to the fans, but at the same time, it would be pretty cool to see Notre Dame win a title. So
the immediate impact, I think, definitely it would be more for the fans.
Yeah, no question about it. So does winning this game give Notre Dame anything extra going into the college football playoff, in your opinion? I mean, is it important to the playoff to you?
I do. I think so, because I think especially if Notre Dame were to lose this game in somewhat convincing fashion, and convincing fashion doesn't even have to be like 30-3 like it was a couple years ago. I just mean like they lose 10 to 14 points, and it's never really – it's kind of like the North Carolina Notre Dame game, but reversed. Where it's like, it was only 14 points, but, we were never really in it. I think that could be something that kind of sucks the confidence out of you a little bit, because you buy into that narrative of, well, last time they didn't have Trevor Lawrence, last time they didn't have this guy, that guy, and the other guy. And then when we played him again, we got smacked around a little bit. I think this is a very confident football team. We know this team can handle success well. They've proven it all year. What we don't know is, can this team handle the ultimate adversity well, which is losing. So there'd be that unknown of how would this team deal with a second, a first loss. I think the other aspect of it too, Vince, for me is I think a win over Clemson would be a big time fuel, because they have heard the whole Trevor didn't play narrative. They've heard it. They have. Most of these kids are on social media. Their friends say it. A lot of these kids are friends with guys that play at Clemson or play at other schools because they do camps together and all this kind of stuff. And they hear that, you guys didn't beat him with Trevor. Well, now if you beat him with Trevor Lawrence and Tyler Davis, now it's like, okay, we can beat Clemson twice. We can beat anybody. Yeah. So they're not going to be afraid of Alabama, which I think a lot of teams will be intimidated by Alabama, because not only is Alabama winning, but Alabama's just killing people.
Nothing's close.
Hey, we had to beat Clemson twice. You know what I mean? And so we can do that. We can play with anybody. And that confidence is needed, especially when you're going to play a team like an Alabama, an Ohio State, a program like that. You're going to need to be supremely confident. Any little bit of doubt in your mind can get exposed in those kind of games. And a victory eliminates any of that doubt, and a loss could allow some of that to creep in just enough for them to not really be 100% sure that they can go out and win a playoff game against an Alabama or Ohio State.
So the narrative of Ian Book and Brian Kelly not being able to win the big game, that was the case going into the first Clemson game. They won that one. That's a big game. Does that narrative just completely go away if they win this one?
Does it go away that they can't win the big one? I think in their minds it's already gone away. I don't think Notre Dame buys the whole, Trevor didn't play kind of thing. You could just tell by Coach Kelly's comments the other day. I don't think they buy that. I think in their mind they think they can win the big one because they beat Clemson.
Sure.
And I think there's validity to that. I mean, look, we said at the time, with Clemson healthy, they're the number one team in the country.
Sure.
At the time.
Yeah.
Because at the time, Alabama's defense was not playing at a level where Alabama deserved to be considered the number one team in the country. I mean, they'd gotten worked a couple games. They just were so good offensively that they were then like Ohio State is now. But now what makes them so good now is now their defense is playing almost at the same level as their offense, which is what makes them scary good. But at the time, you say Clemson's number one, but what we had said was without Trevor Lawrence and those guys, they're still like fourth or fifth. They're still a really good football team. It's not like they were all of a sudden, Syracuse because they didn't have a couple of guys. That was still a really good football team. So I think Notre Dame already believes that. I think from outside the program, I think there would be more validity to a second win over Clemson because they will be healthier.
Okay.
And you can't say, well, they didn't have Joseph Ngata and there was this guy was still hurt. Well, Notre Dame doesn't have Jarrett Patterson and Tommy. Notre Dame's not going to be a necessarily healthy team either. So that whole thing is just out the window. I think a loss sort of gets them back to the other narrative, but we'll talk more about that here in a little bit when we kind of talk more of a macro level, what a win or a loss could mean for Notre Dame.
Well, that's a good place to take a quick pause, Brian. Excuse me. We have another one of our sponsors to get to, and I'll let you lead off here.
Hey, look, this is for Indeed, and 2020 has already reshaped how we work, and it's almost over, thank goodness. Businesses across the globe are challenged to be their most efficient, which means every hire is critical. Indeed is here to help.
Indeed is the number one job site in the world with more total visits than any other job site, and that's according to ComScore. Indeed helps you find quality candidates quickly so you can focus on hiring the person you need to keep your business going.
And unlike other sites, Indeed gives you full control and payment flexibility over your hiring. You only pay for what you need. You can pause your account at any time, and there are no long-term contracts.
And now Indeed's new way of matching you with candidates instantly delivers a short list of quality candidates whose resumes on Indeed match your job criteria that you can contact the moment you sponsor a job, making Indeed the only job site that can move as fast as you do.
73% of online job seekers in the U.S. are visiting Indeed each month, according to ComScore. So it's clear Indeed can help you get the quality hire you need. That's why more than 3 million businesses worldwide are using Indeed for hiring.
Right now, offering our listeners a free $75 credit to boost your job post, which means more quality candidates will see it fast. Try Indeed out with a $75 credit at Indeed.com/BlueWire. This is their best offer available anywhere. So go now to Indeed.com/BlueWire. Offer valid through December 31st. Terms and conditions apply. All right, Bryan. So let's jump back in. We talked about the micro, kind of what it means for this year's team, and I think we've covered that pretty darn well. I think we have to talk about what this means for Notre Dame football in the future. I mean, look, Notre Dame got that big win against Clemson. I think that's big. It somewhat erases like what we talked about. They can't win the big one, right? I think that, that was one of the highest rated football games of the year. So people were watching that game. So what in your mind does this mean for Notre Dame football in the future?
Vince, I think that there's a couple things at stake. Number one, we kind of talked about this earlier, and that is because of the asterisk that a lot of people have placed on the first Clemson game. I don't think it deserves to be there. I mean, that's what football is, right? You're not always going to be your best team. And as I posed to Clemson fans, and of course they reacted exactly how I thought they would react, I said, okay, well, Notre Dame fans will accept the fact that game doesn't mean as much as long as you're willing to admit that your offense could not score against Notre Dame in 2018, could not get touchdowns in 2018 when Julian Love was on the field. Can we accept that?
I mean, it's what happened.
Because it was 9-3 when he went out, and they didn't. I think they had one long touchdown run with basically Notre Dame trying to bring all out blitzes because they were, down. But you couldn't throw the ball on Notre Dame when Julian Love was on the field. So are you going to give that same caveat? And of course, the answer is no. They're not going to give that same caveat. If Notre Dame loses this game and Tyler Davis has a big game, are you going to say, hey, they didn't have Jared Patterson? Of course, Tyler Davis had a big game. No, they're not going to do that. They're going to say, well, you know what? That's part of football, right? And that's kind of how it should be. But the reality is the narrative has been spun in a different direction. So if Notre Dame loses a close game, I don't think it changes anything. I think people say, you know what? That first game was legit. Notre Dame is really, really good. And then we'll get into another topic of conversation here in a few minutes, which is, what makes for a successful 2020 season. As far as saying, did Notre Dame take the next step as a program? I think that what's at stake in this game, in my view, Vince, is you have a chance to confirm that this team is different. Because so far, 10-0, that's not new. Notre Dame has been here, done that.
They've been 12-0.
Right, and twice. And so it's about, okay, can you be 12-0, 11-0, 10-0, whatever, but really win those big games. And if you go out and lose to Clemson in a close game, you can still say, hey, look, we're right on that level. We have that win over Clemson. This game was on a neutral field, all those kind of things. It's hard to beat a team twice. And so, I think there's a lot at stake there. I think if you lose this game convincingly, I think it wipes away that first win. And I think that is something that Notre Dame has to try to avoid. I mean, this has to be a competitive game for Notre Dame. They have to be able to go into this game and say, hey, look, we went toe-to-toe with these guys again. It has to be like the Georgia losses. I mean, that's what it has to be, because those Georgia losses were those what-if games where we said, look, you're at Notre Dame. You don't build your legacy on almost winning. But I think a close loss would validate the first win. That's the difference, because you can say, hey, look, we played them away on a neutral field. They had our game plan. They had played us before. It's just hard to beat a team twice. It rarely happens, especially a really good team twice, and if you look at a lot of the rematches in the past that the same team has won twice, it's usually there's a bigger gap in talent or a bigger gap in ranking. And I think of the 2011 season when LSU beat Alabama at Alabama in overtime, and then they had to play a rematch in the national championship game, and Alabama smacked them. I think it was 21-0. So it's hard to beat anybody twice. It's especially hard to beat a good team twice. And if you get smacked, then I think that just adds to the narrative of, well, you didn't play the real Clemson the first time. And
Right.
I think when we look at just what it means for 2020, that a bad loss would really hurt Notre Dame. And I'm really curious what it does for the legacy. I think as we tie it into kind of the bigger picture, what would make for a successful season, which we'll get into, I think it means now there's even more pressure on you to be successful in the playoff. Sure. I think now now when you talk about what does it mean for the future of Notre Dame football, that's going to entirely hinge on what happens in the next game, whether it be a rematch against Clemson, whether it be Ohio State, whether it be Bama, whatever the case may be, because that's how you can show that this year's different. This year's different than past years. And I think the other thing that it would do is, for me, if Notre Dame loses this game, it should eliminate all the talk that I've never understood from Notre Dame fans. Like, we'd be better off being in a conference because it makes it easier to get into the college football playoff.
Right.
Really? Like, first of all, there's no evidence of that because Notre Dame twice has ranked in the top 4 with a loss and then lost again, and that's why they dropped out. Handle your business, and don't get beat by Miami, and they're in the playoff in 2017, right? Don't lay an egg against the bad Wake Forest and bad Boston College team and then lose to Stanford, and you're in the playoff in 2015. The committee has shown that they respect Notre Dame. They respect the fact that Notre Dame plays a national schedule. They've talked about it. Notre Dame was ranked 4th in 2015. They were as high as 3rd in 2017, despite having lost both times. So this notion of, being in a playoff or being in a conference makes it easier to play. Well, yeah. Well, when you're in a conference, that means sometimes you have to beat Clemson twice.
Yeah, right.
You know what I mean? And that's not necessarily an ideal scenario. If Notre Dame's not in a conference, and let's just say the ACC would have said, "Hey, we'll play you, but we're not gonna include you in the conference championship." Notre Dame's 10-0 right now. Clemson's getting ready to play North Carolina or Miami. And Notre Dame's locked in a playoff spot.
Right.
They're the 2 seed.
They're at home
in.
watching.
Yeah, they're in. So I think that's another thing that affects the future of Notre Dame football is it should quiet some of some of that talk from Notre Dame fans. And then if Notre Dame wins, it's going to silence the outside perspective of, you guys are only good because you're not in a conference. If you were in a conference, it would be a lot tougher for you. Well, okay, you joined a conference and you beat arguably the best program in the country the last 5 years. You beat them twice, right? You would have beaten a quarterback with a 33-1 record who's only one came in the national title game last year in a game where they lost to one of the best teams ever in that LSU team, in a game where they led for half the game. You know what I mean? So I certainly think there's a lot at stake in this game, and it's in 2 different directions. And I think that it puts a lot of pressure on Brian Kelly and this program to go out in the next round and do something impressive. Because if, and again, we'll get into reasons why, but it's going to put a lot more pressure on them in the playoff beyond just you're playing for a title and you need to win for that. It now puts some big picture stigma on this season.
Well, you brought him up, so I'm going to bring him up. Brian Kelly. What does this game alone, not just this season, but this game, does it have anything to do with his legacy? I mean, win or lose, are you looking at Brian Kelly differently Saturday night?
If it's a close loss, no. I think that if it's close loss, it's still okay. The program's better than it was, right?
Yeah,
they have taken a positive step forward. I still feel like there's more that he needs to prove to be that next level coach in Notre Dame. Because, look, who is Brian Kelly at Notre Dame right now? This is what you and I have been saying for a while now, which is Brian Kelly has done an excellent job at Notre Dame from the standpoint of he has brought them a long way from where they were before. They were a mediocre program. They were a borderline top 25 team on a consistent basis. They were coming off a 3-year stretch in which they had a losing record. They went 3-9, 7-6, and 6-6 the last 3 years before he took over. For his first 6 years, they were an up and down team. They had 2 really good seasons, 2012 and 2015, surrounded by a lot of mediocrity, a lot of 8-5s. And of course, you had the 4-8 disaster. The last 4 years, Notre Dame has been a legitimate top 5 to 8 program. I mean, 10-3, 12-1, 11-2. Now you're 10-0. And so he has brought the program a long, long way, and he deserves credit for that. And nothing that can happen against Clemson or against Alabama or against Ohio State can diminish that. The question now is, can he take that next step?
Sure.
And that's something Brian Kelly hasn't proven yet. And I think that this game, if they win it, is further evidence of, okay, they're getting closer. Now, whether or not they've arrived will depend on what happens after that. But I think a loss, especially if it's not a competitive loss, takes some of the shine off of the season and puts a lot of pressure on what you do in the next round. Because if you lose this game and then lose the next game, it's kind of like, well, yeah, you kind of did beat a depleted Clemson team and you finished 10-2, and that's kind of been there, done that.
Right.
Is Brian Kelly really capable of winning the big one at Notre Dame? And now next year you're going to have to try to prove that you are that guy without Ian Book, without 3 to 4 starters along the offensive line, without Javon McKinley, without Ben Skoranek, without your 2 starting defensive ends, without Jeremiah Owusu-Koramoah, without Sean Crawford, possibly without Nick McLeod. You know what I mean? Like the schedule's not super tough next year, but it's going to be challenging enough to where, are you really going to be a team that can go out and compete for a title next year? We don't know. So I think there's a lot at stake for Brian Kelly, not just in this game, Vince, but in the next couple games, in my opinion. No,
that makes a lot of sense. Now, before we wrap up, we want to take one more quick pause for our third sponsor of the day. So let's hear from Bet Online.
Football is back in full swing. You might not be at a game this year, but you can still be in on the action at Bet Online. Bet Online is going the extra mile to make sure you get in on every possible chance to win this season. From game spreads and totals to team, player, and coaching props, Bet Online gives you more options to wager than anywhere else. You can get in on their season opening bonuses today and start off wagering on wins, division, and championship futures all day, every day. Head to Bet Online today and take advantage of all the great sign-up bonuses. Don't forget to use the promo code BLUEWIRE at betonline.ag. That's Blue Wire, all one word. Bet Online, your online sportsbook experts.
Okay, welcome back. We got one more topic I want to get to, Brian, and you prefaced this at the beginning of the episode that we didn't agree when we were talking about this off the air. So let's jump right into this. The question on the table: what would be a successful season in 2020 for Notre Dame, in your opinion? That's the question that is on the table today.
Why don't you start with that, Vince? Because I think that your case and is going to lay out our disagreement here is going to kind of lay out sort of the stakes for this next couple games.
So for me, going into this season, of course, there was question marks up and down. I mean, everything, the schedule, COVID, all of that stuff. There was just question marks all over the place. They have navigated that with expertise up to this point. They're undefeated. They did have to have the one cancellation back at the beginning of the year with Wake Forest. Ended up not even playing the Demon Deacons. But that was because of the ACC, not because of what Notre Dame wanted to do. I think they've been successful up to this point. But again, you mentioned it. We've seen this play out before. We've seen Notre Dame go undefeated in the regular season before, only to basically go down in flames in the postseason. Mm-hmm. So whether you're talking 2012 when they got their doors blown off against Alabama, or you're talking 2018 where you and I don't think it was indicative of the score, but they still lost 30-3 to Clemson. So not good.
And in that game, our argument has been if Julian Love doesn't get hurt, it's a much closer loss.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Because Notre Dame wasn't scoring on Clemson that game. But, maybe they could have got us touchdown if they weren't, down 30-3. Maybe it would have been a 23-13 game. But neither of us have said, hey, Notre Dame wins that game the way it played. But it would have been a much closer game. Right. Yeah.
It's not 30-3. And that was on my birthday. So that was just a bad confluence of events for me. But anyway, so we've seen undefeated, and then we've seen not good. So for me, And I'm not even really looking at the ACC championship. This is a big game. Don't get me wrong. But at the beginning of the season, I wasn't necessarily thinking, got to win an ACC championship, got to win that conference title, because that's just never been in the lexicon of thinking for me. For me, a successful season going in, I was thinking, okay, make it to the playoff. That's great. You got to win a semifinal game. You have to be more competitive against the big boys. And, of course, this was before the win against Clemson. And I would have probably predicted Notre Dame to lose against Clemson in the regular season.
You're talking about if everybody was healthy.
If everybody was healthy, correct. I'm talking like before they played any games, if we were going through the schedule.
We both had Clemson as a loss going into the season.
Exactly.
Because Notre Dame had not proven they could win that game. Now, again, we thought Trevor Lawrence and Tyler Davis
of course.
James Skalski and all those guys were going to play, but still, even then.
Even then I probably –
Georgia had to start a first time. I mean, Georgia didn't have their starting quarterback when they played Notre Dame in 2017 either. Jacob Eason got knocked out in the first game.
True freshman,
right.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's not a new scenario for Notre Dame. They've lost that game in the past.
Right. So if we're talking about taking that next step, for me, taking that next step is winning a national semifinal game and making it to the national championship and being competitive. Of course I want them to win the national championship. Who wouldn't? But for me, for this program to take that next step, it's winning a semifinal game and then being competitive in the national championship. That's successful to me. If Notre Dame does that this year, I mean, of course I'll be disappointed the day they lose the national championship. There's no question. But looking back, once I remove myself from the passion and the emotion of that game, I would look back at 2020 as a successful season.
You're saying even if with a loss to Clemson, if they win a semifinal game and play competitive, you view that as if
they win a semifinal game and then they're competitive in the national championship, I think Notre Dame has taken a step in the right direction.
What about if they lose to Clemson and still do that? That's my question.
Yeah, I think that's still success because they're probably going to end up beating Alabama in the semifinals. So that would be successful to me.
That's kind of part of my thing is I think you have to beat, like for me, Vince, there's two levels of success that Notre Dame is yet to achieve. There's a level that puts them sort of in that either top of the tier 2 or bottom of tier 1 where, you're not quite Bama yet, but you've taken that next step. Because to me, that next step is important. Now, of course, we would all agree that if they just bypass that step and go win it all, that's successful.
Yeah.
To me, though, however, I think a success that we haven't seen from Notre Dame is that victory or series of victories that puts you on a path to where you can now do on the recruiting trail the things you need to do to take the final step. And to me, that's the success that Notre Dame needs to have that we haven't seen yet. That's what losing to Georgia last year did to them. That's what losing to Clemson in 2018 did to them. That's what losing to Miami in 2017 did to them, where a lot of the momentum they had built by having the successful season was diminished because of the way you finished. And so a lot of the positive recruiting vibes that they would get during the season, Notre Dame got a little bit of a bump in recruiting, people feeling good about Notre Dame after the Clemson win, but a lot of the big targets that they were all of a sudden in on, they're not going to get. They're not going to get Kelvin Gilliam, who the Oklahoma DN commit, the top 100 recruit. He's locked into Oklahoma now. You're not going to get Donovan Edwards, the running back from Michigan, who now is basically, Notre Dame kind of steamrolled up his list and then they've fallen back down. Now it looks like it's a Michigan-Georgia battle. So, you said flipped Philip Riley. Well, Philip Riley's a good football player. Is Philip Riley that needle mover that now all of a sudden you're going to beat Alabama because you have Philip Riley? I don't think so. Caleb Johnson's not that guy. Devin Upal is not that guy. Those are good players. You need those guys, but those are guys that Notre Dame's been getting.
Sure.
Right? These kind of wins, you go out and beat Clemson. And here's my thing is a loss to Clemson and Notre Dame has to win a playoff game. Has to. Because if they lose to Clemson and then lose to, Alabama or Ohio State, even in competitive games, this is no different than past seasons. No different. Because now the win over Clemson looks a lot it, didn't mean as much because they didn't have this, that, and the other. You needed double overtime to beat a team that had, 3 of their 4 best players didn't play. You needed double overtime for that. And then when you went and played them again, they beat you. And then when you went and played Ohio State or Alabama in the semifinal, they beat you. So to me, it's same old story. Hey, done a great job to get us here, but is Brian Kelly the guy to get the next step? If that happens, then I got to say no. He hasn't proven that yet. So that's why I feel like a semifinal win is a must if they lose to Clemson. If they beat Clemson, I do think a competitive semifinal loss would tell me that Notre Dame has taken a step forward. If they play Ohio State and lose 30-27, right, and Ohio State wins late, I think that is a successful season. Now, it is not the ultimate success. We're not building a statue for Brian Kelly outside one of the gates at Notre Dame Stadium, right, because that's reserved for the best of the best. You got to win a title to do that. However, absolutely, I do think that kind of season where you beat Clemson a second time with Trevor Lawrence, with Tyler Davis, with those top guys, and then go play Ohio State to a draw, that's now where you can get that 1-2 kids a year that right now you're missing that are the difference between you losing these games and winning these games. Now maybe you can go get your Trevor Lawrence at quarterback. Now maybe you can go get an extra 5-star receiver. Now maybe you can actually get some top-level defensive linemen. And what Notre Dame has been doing has been great, but clearly it hasn't been good enough for them to go out and win a title yet, right?
Sure.
So until you win a title, there's nothing on your team that you can say, yeah, this is title worthy because you haven't won a title, right? So those are the things that you got to look at and say, okay, what's the difference between Notre Dame getting that stud D tackle or that stud linebacker or that stud corner or that stud safety or whatever else that you may decide? What is the thing that's keeping you from going out and hiring that great coordinator that can maybe take you to the next level? Or great recruiter that could take you to the next level. It's proving that you can be a competitive team on that stage. And I think you need at least one win to make that happen. Where you and I disagree is you think even with a win over Clemson, they got to win one more in the semifinal and then be competitive in the title game. I think that they need to be competitive in whatever games they lose. I think a blowout diminishes
all of it. I agree with that.
And
absolutely,
you go out and beat Clemson, go out and beat Ohio State and get destroyed by Alabama. Nobody's going to be talking about how good you looked against Ohio State.
Because then you're Oregon or you're Oklahoma, which Oklahoma's a good program. Don't
you're
get me
Notre
wrong.
Dame 2012.
Yeah, right.
Notre Dame, they don't deserve on the big stage. So Stanford that year wasn't a big stage. Oklahoma on the road that year wasn't a big stage. But why was it all diminished? Because you went and lost to Alabama in an embarrassing fashion. So in 2012 to 2020, you're no different. You've been in the championship stage 3 times and you've gotten embarrassed every time. That no one will care that you won a semifinal game, right? It's all about, you didn't win the big one. So I think competitive loss needs to happen, but I think a win over Clemson and a competitive loss to whoever, barring it like not being Cincinnati, I think, makes for a successful season because I do think that is the kind of needle-moving victory that Notre Dame would have. And then you could give them 2 of them because I think beating them Clemson a second time validates the first win.
That I agree with, yeah.
So
yes.
I don't personally think it needs validation. I think no matter what happens in this game, if my narrative at the end of the year is Brian Kelly can't take Notre Dame to the next level, I'm not going to say, yeah, but that first win didn't count.
Agreed.
I do think look, Clemson wasn't as good of a team without Trevor Lawrence. They're not. And for anyone that says, he threw for 439 yards, I don't care. My stance has always been the same. Stats can be very misleading. He had, I think, 6 or 7 plays that got a big chunk of those yards.
Sure.
And there's a lot of inefficiency. There's reads that he missed that Trevor Lawrence doesn't miss.
It was third down. They were 26% on third down, and they averaged 46% during the season. So
and that first sack in the second overtime, Trevor Lawrence either bangs the back shoulder or he throws the ball. He doesn't hold on to the ball that long, start running around, and then running into a sack. The second sack would have happened because Dalen Hayes just killed that guard.
Yes, agreed.
But the first sack doesn't happen. And then the second sack probably doesn't happen if the first sack doesn't happen.
It's a different defensive call at that point.
Right. You're not going to have, Dalen Hayes lined up over a guard on 2nd and 2, right? Or 1st and 10 at the 12. So, he doesn't make that mistake. So does that mean Notre Dame wouldn't have beat Clemson with Trevor Lawrence? I'm not saying that at all. I still think Notre Dame could have beat Clemson even if Clemson was healthy, if they played their game. But they need that. To me, that win validates it. And now I think the only way to validate this season, if you lose to Clemson, is to win it all. Because I think a loss to Clemson and then you beat Ohio State and then a loss to Alabama, I don't know how much that moves the needle unless it's a really close loss. I think if they lose 2 games close and then beat Ohio State close, you could say, oh, look, they played 4 really, really, really good teams this year and went 2-2. That's better than what they've done. So to me, again, that would be a step in the right direction. I think it would leave a bitter taste in a lot of people's mouths because you lost 2 out of 3. But I still think that's a successful season because I think if a good coaching staff that can recruit well, and we'll find out if this staff is capable of that, and there's going to be some new coaches on defense most likely.
Your turnover.
So that says, okay, well, how does Tommy Rees, how's he capable of spinning this into the 2022 class, right? How is Jeff Quinn able to use this to get Zach Rice, to get a next level offensive line class? His first 2 offensive line classes were good. This 2021 class is really good. It's not elite because there's 2 great players and then there's 3 guys that you're like, I'm not as sold on, right? How does Lance Taylor use this to get a great back next year? How does the receivers coach use this to get, next level receivers? Those kind of things, right? So, but I do think it gives them the ammo, even a close loss to Clemson with a win in the semifinal or a win over Clemson and close loss in the semifinal gives Notre Dame the ammo to say, hey, look, we were 11-1 in a crazy year, beat Clemson twice. We played a fresh Ohio State team that had only played 6 games. Yeah. They weren't as worn out as we were. They didn't have the injury because when did Notre Dame's injury start happening? Games 8, 9, 10. Ohio State's never going to get there, right? So that's why I think it is also unfair that Ohio State be considered for the playoff because they're going to be in situations where when did Clemson's injury start piling up? Again, some of those were later in the year. Tyler Davis was early, but a lot of these were kind of like games 6, 7, 8, things like that. So you say, look, it was we battled, we went to, but we were missing some key pieces, and that's the reason they beat us by a field goal. I think that is a successful season. Beating Clemson and losing in the semifinals to anybody in a close game is a successful season. Losing to Clemson in a close game, beating Ohio State, and then losing to Alabama in a close game would also make for a successful season. Now, the record wouldn't look a lot different. It'd be 11-2. We've seen that before.
Yeah.
But my issue with 11-2 last year was you didn't beat anybody. That's your best win was over what? Navy? Right? 11-2 this year, and you beat Clemson twice, or you beat Clemson once and beat Ohio State. That's a tremendously different season.
Oh,
and I think that's the season that could vault them into the upper echelon recruiting. Because as I've said, Vince, before, you say Notre Dame's got to recruit better. Recruiting better doesn't mean they got to sign 7, 8 different players a year. It's 1 or 2 guys a year, 1 or 2 elite players a year. Give me a Kyle Hamilton and a top offensive player every year. Give me that kind of player every year, and now all of a sudden you're building that. Whereas what's happening now is Notre Dame gets Kyle Hamilton in 2019, and then 2 years go by and they haven't gotten another Kyle Hamilton. Right? That's the difference. They get a Chris Tyree, but then what do you do the year after? Logan Diggs is a good player. I like Logan Diggs, but you got to start doing that year after year where you're getting those difference makers. And to me, that's what at least one more big win could do for Notre Dame, assuming that the losses that happen are close.
Sure.
And that's where I'm coming from. So that's where we kind of differ. I don't think a playoff win is needed to be that. If they lose to Clemson, however, then now you have to win a playoff game. Because if you lose to Clemson and then lose a playoff game, even if they're both close, you're hanging your hat on a win over Clemson where
they were depleted. Well, not depleted, but you know what I mean.
They were depleted. I mean, look, they didn't have their 3 of their 4 best defensive players didn't play. Their best overall player, arguably the greatest player they've ever had, although Deshaun Watson would have some words with that. But,
he got beat by Mitch Trubisky this weekend.
I'm talking about in college. I don't care what happens in the NFL. I don't give a rip about what happens in the NFL. Well, Mitch Trubisky was drafted higher than he was, so. But Bears fans. The point, however, is to beat that team without him and then lose to them the second time and then lose to Ohio State from a perception standpoint and from a recruiting standpoint sucks a lot of the life away of that win.
I get it.
It just does. So they need to win another game, and they can't lose and if they lose, even if they go 1-2 and they're close losses, as long as they still get that one, I think that makes for a successful season. Now, it's still the question of can Brian Kelly win the big one still exists, because that's going to exist if they beat Clemson and they beat Ohio State and then lose to Alabama. That question is still going to exist
because they didn't beat Alabama.
Right. You know, if they lose to Clemson, beat Alabama in a semifinal, and lose in the title game to Ohio State or Clemson in a rematch, you know, that's a great season in my opinion for Notre Dame, because you beat Alabama and Clemson. But you still have to ask the question, can he win the big one?
Sure.
But I do think those scenarios move the needle. Again, it puts him into the top of that tier 2, into maybe the lower echelon of tier 1. Because I think now you'd say Notre Dame has played for a title 3 times in the last 8 years. There's not a lot of teams that can do that. Georgia can't say that, right? Ohio State can't say that. Well, Ohio State can say that. They've actually because they were 14, 16, and 18 and now this year. So they could say that. Alabama could say that. Clemson could say that. That's it. LSU's only been on that stage twice. Now, they won one, right? But Florida State can't say that. They've been on the stage twice, right? And to say that, hey, we've been on this stage 3 times, and this year we were more competitive than we've ever been, we actually beat some of those teams, says Notre Dame's they've grown as a program. Now it's about, okay, now what do you do with that?
Gotcha.
I think that's going to be my big thing. What do you use that to now bring in a better recruiting class, or do you do what Brian Kelly did after 2015, which is we just got to coach a little better and play a little harder? Because that's not the answer. It's use this to make your program better. Use this to say we're going to go get a great defensive coordinator or a great coach or assistant coach, or we're going to get these next level recruits. These guys that we've been missing on, we're going to get them now. Because if you don't do that and you don't take advantage of it, then what was this all for? You know, that just tells me you're content being an almost program. This year's an opportunity for you to stop being an almost program.
Yep, I agree. So that's going to do it for us. But stay tuned, because January 12th, we're going to have a podcast out to see who was right and whether we think it was a successful 2020 season or not. Of course, that is the day after the national championship game, assuming everything goes according to plan, which who knows? That'll be 2021. So maybe it'll be better. I don't know.
I may stay in Miami a couple extra days if Notre Dame's playing in the national title game, just a heads up. I may do that podcast from a beach. Just saying.
We better be sharing a tropical drink down there. But anyway, that's another conversation. So you're so mean. All right. So anyway, that's going to do it for us today. Of course, don't forget, National Signing Day is coming this week. And stay locked in to IrishBreakdown.com, as well as our podcast wherever you download your podcast, because we are going to be teeming with information for you on this year's class. We're going to break it down for you on the website, on the podcast. So stay tuned because there's going to be all kinds of awesome information. You want to add anything before we sign off, sir?
No, we're good. Just make sure you stay locked in IrishBreakdown.com. Make sure, obviously, you're following us on our podcast. We're very, very excited to be with Blue Wire Pods. They had a big announcement today about some new growth that they're doing as a company. Then we're excited to be part of that. And, of course, make sure you check out our YouTube channel, because this podcast and a lot of the others are going to be on the YouTube channel. And, we're just excited. We're just going to keep growing, and glad to have you all along for the ride.
All right, so that'll do it for us. And we will talk to you next time on our Irish Breakdown podcast.